Furi, a game released in 2016 by an indie developer known as the Game Bakers, pits players against a lineup of vicious bosses one after another, telling them that their only way out is to fight through each and every one of them. Acting as nothing more than a boss rush strung together by brief walking segments, Furi places its primary focus on a combination of refined top-down bullet hell mechanics and visceral one-on-one hack-and-slash combat. The game opens with the sight of a cruel, white-masked individual mercilessly beating the main character, while insisting that he'll never escape from his imprisonment. As soon as the jailer walks away, though, a man wearing a rabbit mask appears and tells the stranger that it's time to go. Dropping a sword on the ground before the prisoner, he states that he'll have to fight for his freedom. The jailer is the key. Kill him and you'll be free. With nothing but this sentiment to motivate them, players are thrust into a confrontation with the first boss, the very same individual that was just threatening the stranger with a lifetime of slow, painful deaths. The chain acts as an introduction to Furi's mechanics. Fights in Furi consist of battling through several phases, with each phase being marked by small squares below a boss's health bar. By depleting an opponent's HP over and over, the player is able to slowly work their way through several stages of increasing difficulty, each phase being defined by the different attacks and behaviors the boss throws at them. Similarly though, the player can also lose their entire health bar. The stranger has 3 of what essentially act as extra lives, allowing him to continue fighting even after losing all of his health against a boss. Anytime a boss transitions phases or the player is knocked down, however, both parties heal all of their missing health, ensuring that every phase of the fight starts with both combatants in perfect form. Thus, fights can end up lasting for several minutes, both the player and the boss falling several times throughout. However, if the player ever loses all of their extra lives, they'll be forced to fully restart a fight from the beginning. One advantage the stranger has over the enemies he faces in Furi, though, is his ability to regenerate. Not only does the player regain an extra life for each time a boss phase is defeated, but the idea of the player completely losing to bosses over and over and simply getting back up again afterwards is actually one of the stranger's canonical abilities. The jailers can never truly kill the player, unless it's only a matter of time and perseverance before they all fall. The tools the player has to actually defeat bosses are rather simple: a sword and a gun, and the ability to dash and parry. The stranger's moveset comes down to these 4 core mechanics, and the player is tasked with making use of all of them in order to triumph over the bosses of Furi. There is a bit more to them than simply binary inputs, though. The sword slash, gunshot, and dash can all be charged to increase their potency, giving several of the player's essential tools even more flexibility. With all of their abilities laid out before them from the start, the player is immediately provided with everything they need to find success against the many challenges of Furi. Upon conquering the chain, the player is able to engage with the only aspect of gameplay outside of the boss fights, a brief segment where they walk towards the next boss, accompanied by purely one-sided dialogue from the man in the rabbit mask, also known very fittingly as the Voice. As they walk towards their next fight, players are able to take in the incredible, sometimes physics-defying sights of each level of the massive prison in which the stranger has been incarcerated. Though doing nothing but walking isn't particularly engaging gameplay in a vacuum, the downtime that Furi provides in these segments serves as an excellent break between the pure adrenaline rushes that each fight in the game becomes. The insight that the Voice provides about his own motivations, the story of the jailers that the player fights, and the true identity of the stranger also help to break up the intense gameplay with calm moments of learning and reflection. The way that Furi splits up its boss fights with these instances of minimal control and lengthy dialogue is perfectly in line with the storytelling method known as the String of Pearls. Each boss fight is a pearl that gives the player the freedom to use all of the mechanics at their disposal, and the walking segments are the strings that hold them all together. The game continues like this for essentially its entire course, with each fight being connected by nothing but walking, talking, and beautiful scenery. And so, the player defeats boss after boss, all while an intense synth-heavy soundtrack of immense quality pushes them forward in each confrontation. They begin to learn more about the people and world around them. The player sees from the very start that the ones imprisoning the stranger are relentless and cruel, and the player is perfectly justified in their violent breakout. As they continue to fight through more and more of the jailers, though, the player realizes that their cause may not be the most righteous. The bosses that the stranger fights quickly go from being inarguably despicable to morally questionable. Eventually it becomes obvious that every boss fallen in the wake of the player was trying to keep them in prison for good reason. Through dialogue with bosses and the oft-present narration from the Voice, Furi is a game that has a lot to say about how one person's selfishness can eventually lead to acts of selflessness, especially as seen in the game's true end. I won't spoil the conclusion of the narrative that the developers designed, though, since Furi is a great game, and anyone watching this should go and play it for its incredible combat, amazing soundtrack, satisfying mechanics, intriguing story, and so on. I didn't always feel this way about the game, though. I first started Furi a few years ago on the recommendation of one of my favorite YouTubers, and I proceeded through the game as any other player would. I thought that it was fairly fun, and that the narrative was relatively interesting. It felt like it was missing something. Even still, I ran through Furi's story in a single day, and felt satisfied with the experience I'd gotten. Surprisingly enough, though, the game actually gave me a letter grade when I beat it, and said that a new difficulty called Furier had been unlocked. I didn't think much of it at the time, since I had just finished the game and was mentally checked out of it. And so I went on to quickly forget about Furi, and the extra challenge it had presented to me, becoming just another pretty good game in a pile of many others.
Watch me. Excellence is not an art, it's pure habit. We are what we repeatedly do.
Years later, I decided to return to Furi. I think I was probably compelled by the idea of knocking out the rest of the achievements in the game, and I figured it wouldn't be too difficult considering its relatively short length. Not really expecting much, I jumped back in and decided to go ahead and give Furier difficulty a try. I thought it would probably just end up being frustrating. There was no harm in giving it a shot. Immediately, the Chain, who had just been a relatively straightforward tutorial boss on Furi difficulty, completely skipped all of his introductory phases and started absolutely destroying me. I was shocked that such a joke of a boss on the normal difficulty was suddenly presenting a very real challenge. I persevered anyways and went on to finally beat the Chain after several more attempts. At this point, I was a little nervous about what the rest of the significantly more advanced bosses would look like on this difficulty, and I decided to continue on anyways. Little did I know, I had just begun the path to enjoying the game far more than I ever had in the past as my mastery of its system slowly grew. Furi isn't particularly explicit about it, but it actually offers several avenues for players to improve their skills. A section of the game's menu allows players to choose from several different modes, all of which encourage them to master the game through various means. The speedrun mode skips all of the game's walking segments and cutscenes so those who have played the game can purely focus on sections that test their skills. There are even achievements tied to beating a run faster than the game's developers could. The practice mode lets you refight any boss on any difficulty, allowing players to improve against a particular boss as much as they want. There are even DLC fights that present an even greater challenge than the base game. All of these modes, very critically, measure stats like hits taken, knockdowns received, and how quickly the boss is dispatched, eventually awarding the player a letter grade for their performance. By doing so, Furi gives players a tangible measure of their improvement, and encourages them to always keep improving. Defeating bosses with better letter grades on harder difficulties even unlocks concept art of them, providing the player a real reward for honing their skills. Having missed most of these things on my first playthrough, I was surprised and appreciative of the fact that the developers had put so much effort into facilitating player improvement. So, I continued my journey through Furi's hardest difficulty. Many bosses acted as serious roadblocks in my journey, having become vastly stronger than they were in Furi difficulty. Nearly everything about them had become more difficult. I was forced to truly think about what I was doing wrong and how I could improve. The game had put my skills to the test, and I was having more fun than the normal difficulty had ever come close to. After getting knocked down hundreds of times, pushing through some insanely tight bullet hell segments that had initially seemed impossible, and almost fully conquering the challenge, I arrived at what essentially acts as the game's final required boss. The Edge is a samurai who shares many similarities with the game's protagonist, and he's committed himself to a life of discipline and training. The voice states that he doesn't understand how one man can so wholly dedicate himself to his craft. The Edge did exactly that over the years he spent waiting for the stranger to appear before him. Though the Edge is hardly changed by the Fury or difficulty, he still poses a significant challenge to players. The reason I bring him up, though, is because of his philosophy and the way the gameplay of Furi mirrors it. As I stated before, developers offer a small set of tools to the player with the stranger's moveset, along with several different methods for them to master every aspect of it. The Edge, every time he beats the player, speaks of how he wants to see the best from them, how mastery comes from habit, and that the stranger has more strengths than he thinks. Even though the Edge is putting his life on the line, he still preaches his ideology directly to the player, that they should never give up, and always strive to bring out the most in themselves. Amazingly enough, the Edge acts as one of, if not the hardest fight in the game outside of the true final boss. The duel against him consists of purely tense one-on-one sword fights where any mistake could lead to a devastating hit for either side. However, If the player takes the Edge's philosophy to heart and truly masters every aspect of the fight, it can become one of the quickest and simplest in the game. With perfect timing and parries, some of the Edge's phases can actually be killed in a single hit. By achieving discipline and mastery, the duel against the Edge becomes one of the most satisfying to completely dismantle, and one of the core concepts of the game and its developers can be clearly seen through doing so. When I reached this part in my journey and figured out how excellent and rewarding this fight truly was, I began to realize what an incredible game Furi is. Finally pushing through to the end of the game, I felt pride in my achievement for beating the hardest difficulty as I watched the credits roll. I knew I still had more to achieve, as I still needed to achieve an S rank on Furia difficulty as well as wanting to fight some of the game's optional bosses. I was proud of myself for overcoming all of Furi's required challenges. As I sat there reflecting though, I was surprised to see a message scrolling onto my screen as the credits faded from sight. Developers themselves had actually left a note for those who were brave enough to take down the game's hardest difficulty, and as I read it, I knew that I had made the right choice by persevering through all of the challenges that had come before. Fury had pushed me to master its mechanics and overcome its hardest challenges, never pulling its punches, but also always being there to offer ways for me to improve myself. And as I read the message from the developers saying that I had played Fury the right way by challenging myself and practicing until I had mastered the game, I knew right then that I had experienced something truly special.